The greatest danger posed by the Ivy League is not what it fails to teach, but what it convinces its students they already know. There was a time when Harvard, Yale, and their Ivy League counterparts were regarded as the crown jewels of American education, institutions where the brightest minds pursued knowledge, truth, and intellectual humility. That time has passed. What we are witnessing now is not simply the decline of academic rigor, but the rise of ideological dogma masquerading as education, and it is doing real harm to the nation. The Ivy League today is not a collection of institutions pursuing excellence. It is a cartel of credentialism, a bastion of groupthink, and a bureaucracy more concerned with image than substance. These schools have traded in the pursuit of truth for the preservation of narrative. And narratives, unlike facts, do not need to be proven. They only need to be repeated loudly and often enough to silence opposition. Let us begin with the illusion of excellence. The prestige of a Harvard or Yale is now less about what students learn than about what it signals. Admission into a social class rather than a community of scholars. The average American still believes that an Ivy League diploma is a marker of intellect. But when grade inflation is so rampant that more than 90% of students at Harvard graduate with honors, what does that honor mean? When ideology dictates the hiring of faculty, when classroom discussions are policed by unspoken and sometimes very explicit rules of political correctness, what kind of intellectual environment are we really creating? The answer is an intellectually hostile one where dissent is punished, where conformity is rewarded, and where credentials are treated as a stand-in for competence. This is what I have called in my book, Intellectual Society, the tendency of the anointed, a self-congratulatory elite, to believe they are not only more knowledgeable, but more virtuous, and thus uniquely qualified to tell the rest of us how to live. Nowhere is this more visible than in the Ivy League. These institutions are no longer places where ideas compete. They are places where one particular vision, what I described in the vision of the anointed, is elevated beyond scrutiny. It is a vision characterized by lofty rhetoric, noble-sounding goals, and a complete disregard for unintended consequences. The anointed do not measure success by results, they measure it by their intentions, and by whether those intentions conform to the orthodoxy of the moment. I remember when I was a student at Harvard in the 1950s, I walked into the Widener Library, a majestic cathedral of knowledge, with the expectation that I was stepping into a world that valued ideas above all. And in many ways, I was. But even then, I noticed something. It wasn't enough to be correct. You had to be fashionable in your thinking. You had to echo the assumptions of your professors. I had one professor who told me, after reviewing an essay I wrote on Marxism, "Tom, you write well, but you're too skeptical," as if skepticism was a flaw in academia. This brings us to affirmative action and racial preferences. In my book, Affirmative Action Around the World, I examine how these policies, while well-intentioned, often harm the very people they claim to help. And yet the Ivy League continues to implement them with a kind of moral arrogance that resists both evidence and logic. Harvard was recently the subject of a lawsuit, Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard, where it was revealed that the university systematically discriminated against Asian American applicants in order to maintain its preferred racial balance. Applicants with higher test scores, stronger extracurriculars, and better recommendations were routinely scored lower on subjective criteria such as personality. This is not a bug in the system, it is the system. It is the inevitable result of an ideology that values optics over fairness and narrative over merit. And what is the justification that diversity, however vaguely defined, is so important that it justifies treating individuals not as individuals but as representatives of racial categories? But once we begin down that road, there is no logical stopping point. If race can override merit, why not gender? Why not sexual identity? Why not political ideology? And that is precisely where we are now. The growth of DEI bureaucracies within the Ivy League is not an academic development, it is a political one. These bureaucracies now rival or even exceed the number of traditional academic departments in some institutions. Their purpose is not education, it is indoctrination. In Columbia University, for example, students are required to take courses where identity politics is not one lens among many, but the dominant framework through which history, literature, and society must be interpreted. At Yale, faculty members have been subjected to investigations or public condemnation simply for expressing views that deviate from the prevailing narrative. At Princeton, a professor who defended meritocracy found himself under siege not for misconduct, but for heresy. I recall a debate I participated in years ago where a fellow academic from one of these institutions argued that free speech must be balanced against the emotional safety of students. I asked him a simple question: who decides which speech is safe? He couldn't answer. Because the moment you allow feelings to dictate facts, truth becomes subjective, and those in power get to rewrite it. The cost of this intellectual intolerance is not confined to campuses. Ivy League graduates populate the ranks of media, government, and corporate leadership. The ideas they absorb do not remain in the classroom. They are exported, often with disastrous consequences. Consider the role of elite academic theories in shaping housing policy. Rent control, zoning restrictions, and government housing experiments, all rooted in ideas promoted by academic elites, have not solved a housing crisis. They have exacerbated it. The same is true of minimum wage laws, where raising the cost of labor without regard to supply and demand has consistently priced low-skilled workers, especially minorities, out of jobs. And yet these failed policies are never attributed to their intellectual authors. Why? Because the Ivy League teaches its students that good intentions matter more than outcomes, and that disagreement is not just incorrect, it is immoral. This moral preening is perhaps the most dangerous aspect of elite academia. When institutions become convinced of their own moral infallibility, they become incapable of self-correction. They see dissent not as a necessary feature of intellectual life, but as a threat to their legitimacy. History offers many examples of what happens when insulated elites go unchecked. The Mandarin class of imperial China, trained to memorize Confucian texts, but utterly disconnected from the peasantry, presided over centuries of stagnation. The French intelligentsia of the 18th century, drunk on abstract theories, helped ignite a revolution that descended into tyranny. The Soviet Union's centralized intellectual class, convinced it could plan an entire economy, ended up planning decades of human misery. In all these cases, what began as a faith in the superior wisdom of an educated elite ended in disaster. What makes the current situation so troubling is not simply that the Ivy League is misguided. It is that it no longer recognizes the possibility that it could be wrong. When Harvard revoked admission offers to students for private messages deemed offensive, it sent a clear signal. You are not just being evaluated for academic potential, you are being judged for ideological purity. When Stanford Law School students shouted down a federal judge invited to speak and administrators sided with the mob, they demonstrated that free inquiry is no longer sacred. Conformity is. And when these same institutions continue to graduate individuals who go on to craft national policy, shape public discourse, and lead major corporations, we are not just dealing with academic rot. We are dealing with the slow erosion of a free society. Freedom depends not only on the right to speak, but on the willingness of others to hear ideas they may not like. It depends on the humility to accept that no one group, however credentialed, has a monopoly on truth. It depends on institutions that value facts over feelings, results over rhetoric, and liberty over orthodoxy. The Ivy League has failed on all accounts. We must ask ourselves, Do we want a society governed by ideas tested in the real world, or one ruled by people whose only qualification is that they impress the right admissions committee? Do we want public policy shaped by what works or by what flatters the self-image of those who believe they are destined to lead? The time has come to stop treating Ivy League credentials as evidence of wisdom or virtue. A piece of paper from Harvard tells us nothing about a person's integrity, common sense, or capacity for leadership. It tells us only that they succeeded at playing a particular game in a particular environment at a particular point in time. That may be impressive, but it is not enough. In Discrimination and Disparities, I argue that disparities are not always evidence of discrimination, and the complex social outcomes cannot be explained by simple narratives. The same is true of institutions. The failure of the Ivy League to live up to its own ideals is not due to a single cause. It is the result of many: arrogance, ideological capture, and the absence of accountability. And unless we confront these failures honestly, the cost will not be measured in academic standards. It will be measured in the slow, quiet decline of a society that no longer values truth, when the best and brightest become the most arrogant and insulated. It is not brilliance we should fear, but blindness.
Because the flag still stands for freedom, and they can't take that